stanzas. You may remain seated if you'd like.
Good evening. Thank you for being here again. Those of you who have been here at least 1 week prior to this, thank you for coming and coming back. It's not a compliment to me, but it's a compliment to what we have been through the years, that you have the interest to continue coming and hear the conclusion, to hear the story up to this point. I'm probably a little more nervous tonight than I have been the previous 2 weeks because there were few folks who could question any of the things I said up to this point. Many of you have been a part of this, what we're talking about tonight, and much of this was right before I was born. So this puts me in a position tonight of standing here talking about things that you might think I don't know anything about. And that might be the case. And so what we'll do is, as we go through this, if you hear things, this is primarily information I'll share that I gathered on the way to where I've been going over the past 17 years. And if you find information that is partly correct or totally incorrect, please let us know. It won't hurt my feelings at all, because anything you hear tonight is something that I've either been told within the past 17 years or I have read or something of that nature. So help us. This is a continuing process, and we will try our best to continue putting the history together in a manner that's going to be a beneficial tool, a useful tool to the church as we continue to move forward in the days to come. We have been through World War II. The city is slowing down from the prosperity that had come about as a result of the wartime demands on the industry and labor. The church had benefited from much of what had taken place because as many young people were off serving their country, the church was, as Loray has had a habit of doing through the years, the church was training the folks who were here to do the jobs that needed to be done. And so there was a large core of workers, folks who had been trained to do the jobs to which they were called. And we see that upon the arrival of Dr. Frank H. Malone in 1947, as we ended last week, we talked about the fact that the church was united and cooperative in spirit. And that's where we left off last week. large numbers of people, but as we heard this morning, times they are changing. Probably, we heard this morning about the 60s being very turbulent times. Post-World War II, United States of America was a time that change was taking place, like an 18-wheeler going downhill out of control. There were millions of young people returning from service who had come back and who were tired of growing up during the Depression. And at the time that they had looked at life as the unfolding possibilities for them as they were about to launch out into life and start families, they were called into service and had to go away from home. So all of this pent-up demand, plus all of the demand for goods and services that had been unavailable during the Second World War, all of this was within a year and a half after the end of the Second World War, as many of you recall, was unleashed. And it was felt, probably, that the impact was felt more in the textile villages of Gastonia as much as anywhere else in the nation. It had been, looking back on it, possibly a rather simple life. Folks knew many people in the communities, very tight-knit communities. The churches were surrounded by their members. After World War II, many things began to happen that were probably unforeseen at the time that the war did end. Membership, and we talked about what the church had been, and the fact that this morning we heard that the church had been somewhat innovative through the years. We've heard at Loray from time to time that we've always done it this way. Well, if you look back on the history of the church, we have not always done anything the same way for a long period of time. Throughout the church's history, the church has been able to thrive because of the fact that the church has been innovative. Sometimes reluctantly innovative, but we've been innovative. Following World War II, much of the growth of this church, in spite of the fact that churches were being organized in outlying communities built upon what once had been farmland and woods and things that had been used for land that had been used for other purposes. Churches were being organized out there. Loray was having a part in some of that, largely by providing members. But as we see, Loray was able to take advantage of the fact that and this is a map of the Firestone Village. Immediately or shortly after World War II, you can see one of the housing projects, which I believe is off Overhill. And you can see this map is actually a map that was used, and some of you might even recall this, as a visitation map. It is divided into sections, and I imagine these were captains of the teams that were to go out and visit folks. And some of you might have been visited by some of these folks. Mrs. W.R. Turner Sr. Is mentioned here. Ray England and Harold Robbins. Those names are on here, and I would assume those are captains of the visiting teams that were moving out through the community. This was also taking place at other places around the city as Loray moved out, visited, evangelized, did the things that we were supposed to do as a church so that we might spread the gospel, and we might also strengthen the church so that we can better do the task that we've been called to do. Because of membership growth and the things that took place because of the work of the people had a mind to work. There were steps taken immediately or shortly after the arrival of Dr. Malone. The building fund, which had been begun in 1939 and largely through the war, was built through the purchase of war bonds. The building fund was $86,000. Now we've got to remember again, we think about that now and you think $86,000 won't buy a whole lot of a house now. But in 1947, 1948, 1949, you're talking about, that's a lot of money for a group of people who were still largely medical textile workers to have accumulated, especially during wartime. This money was there, and the younger members, as O.J. Walbert said, were agitating to build a new building. And of course, we talked last week about the old building being in a rather dilapidated condition. The bell tower was beginning to lean away from the building, and nothing could stop that, apparently. And the additions where basements had been dug, supposedly, as I've heard, had leaked like a sieve. And even though concrete walls were poured all around the building, that continued to be a problem. It just was something that the younger members were almost demanding that they have a new facility. There was, in 1949, a building committee that had been appointed that was chaired by W.G. Henson. The committee included A.D. Blanton, Buford Blanton, Winston Crawford, and Hugh Struve. The architect, Mr. Marvin Helms, and unfortunately we don't have the original drawing like we have of the educational building. There was one. There's a picture of the picture, but the actual drawing apparently does not exist. But the Marvin Helms was an architect of the old school that still believed that a church building should be a monumental structure and should be of classical design. He came up with a design for this church building, and it supposedly in the beginning was to have the bell tower located in the center of the building. Just a traditional sort of symmetrical design. The story that was related to me by one of the committee members was that one day Hugh Struve was riding down Ozark Avenue by the newly completed East Methodist Church, now Faith Methodist Church, and noticed the design of that building, and noticed that the bell tower was set to one side. It was a Gothic sort of design, and he brought word back to the building committee, and upon viewing this, there was a decision made at some point in time to change the design of the church building. Rather than it being one with just the bell tower located over the building, he said we could build this style for the same amount of money. The church was to be surprised how much money that was going to be, as many of you probably remember. But this design was arrived at by Mr. Helms, was presented to the church, at a time that the building fund had increased to $130,000. A finance committee and a publicity committee had been working for some time. The church felt that $190,000 would build the church. And you've got to remember that at that point in time, the church was to be the sanctuary and the educational wings on either side. There was not a children's building, an educational building at the back. In fact, there were still houses back there. The horseshoe that was Firestone Circle was still located back there. And I, in the misty memories of my very, very young childhood, remember some of those houses standing there. So those are some of my early memories. The plans, when presented to the church was shocked to find that the total cost of the building was to be $267,000. It was decided that air conditioning, and this shows how folks look at what things are necessities and what things are luxuries. Decision was made to omit for the time air conditioning to the building, and also to delay some of the painting, the final painting of the building, reduce the cost to $249,000, and then the Croswell Construction Company of Columbia, South Carolina was engaged to do the work at that point in time. The law was cleared and construction was begun. There's a story told, and some of you might shed more light on this, that the bell was rescued from the old church. That I'm not sure, but the stories that I've been told was that the church was going to be, the building was going to be torn down, and that someone at some point in time decided that, hey, we need a bell, we've got a bell, let's save the bell. And so one of the things that was saved from the old building was the bell. And unfortunately, many of the other things that, some records, I'm sure photographs, all sorts of things, heard some word about some fires being built behind the building. So from the understanding that I have, some of the things were just discarded. History is viewed differently by different folks. And what might just have been just an overabundance of records might have been things that would have answered some of the questions that we have today. Some of you sitting here tonight might possibly have some of the answers to those questions. There was a baptistry painting, and I meant before I came out here tonight to pull the article out, but I did happen to come across an article. The painting in our baptistry is part of a disappearing art form. If it ever comes to the church to make a decision on what to do with that, whether to restore it or just to paint over it or do something else, there are fewer and fewer churches that actually have baptistry paintings. And this was done by a lady, and I do apologize to you. We have that information, though, in file. There was a lady who painted this, and she did several in this area and in the southeast. The biblical recorder several years ago requested information on those churches that still had baptistry paintings. So what we have is a treasure, and if nobody ever says anything else to you about it again, we need to save it at all costs. If there's ever a question as to whether we need to do something else to the baptistry, that is something that is worth holding on to from a heritage standpoint. The church continued to move forward, and we were fortunate to get a photograph, as it is in the history, of the church building under construction at that point in time. The Korean War, as the building was beginning, the Korean War broke out, and it continued until a truce was signed in July of '53. This, as future conflicts would affect the church much less than the world wars that had, although they affected the lives of individuals and the lives of families, there was not as much of an interruption in the ministry of the church as through the two previous wars. The Brotherhood of the church was organized in 1951, and Alan Harmon, who had been one of the moving forces behind the organization of the Brotherhood, did this and was chosen the first president of it. Now, he left the church, was transferred through job or something. We don't know anything. Some of you might remember Alan Harmon. We don't have any information about him except his name. There he was, and then he was gone. But he was noted for being the first president of the Brotherhood. By March of 1952, this building was nearing completion, and the people of the church anticipated the move. That had been the home of Loray Baptist Church since 1905, or since 1907 when the building actually opened. The church had never been located anywhere else, and it was getting ready to move into a structure that was one of the most impressive, if not the most impressive structures besides the mill on this end of Franklin Boulevard, or Franklin Avenue at that point in time. The building was moving near completion. Final touches were placed upon it, and on Easter Sunday, April 13, 1952, an overflow congregation filled the sanctuary to capacity, and even standing out in the narthex of the church. We're here, and it's almost an uncomfortable looking group. Some of you were here. Was I here? I was here. I wasn't here. Was I here? I was in the room. I was not here. Some of you were here. You might remember this, but this is sort of an uncomfortable looking group. It's like coming from the country to the city, maybe. Some of you might, I hope you will, because this is very important, share your feelings on that first Sunday when if you were here and moved from there over here. Just looking at it, looks like Some of the folks are saying, a little too fancy. It's a real nice place. I don't want to touch anything or anything like that. We have, this is one of the things, this is the Marine Flex photos. This is one of the things that we have beaten ourselves over the head with for years and years, saying, I remember, people would say, I remember when the church was so full that we had to put chairs in the aisles. Probably there were not many times that we had to put chairs in the aisles after this Sunday. That might be the case, but there were chairs in the aisles on that opening Sunday. But this is something for us to have celebrated and not to beat ourselves up about. Because this was not something that we missed the mark by not doing this. This was a lot of people turning out to see the new building. And there are many newspaper accounts of this. There's this one here is here for your inspection. If you've not already read that, there's some back in the history room. It was a big deal. Loray was one of the old, strong churches of the city. The third Baptist church in the city of Gastonia. It was, the city had a population in 1950 of 23,069 people. And there were over 1,000 of those folks present the day Loray Baptist Church opened. Some of the things that happened that day, the overflow congregation was over 1,000 people. Dedication service was held, and the keys to the building were given to A.D. Blanton, who was chairman of the Board of Deacons. By the chairman of the building committee, Mr. W.G. Henson. There was a 2:30 service held, and scripture was read by Reverend J.D. Moose, who was the second pastor of Loray. Does anybody remember Reverend Moose? Reverend Moose reading the scripture there. You were hearing, if you were there, you were hearing history as the second pastor of Loray Baptist Church from another time, another age, had come to this place that you're in now and connected, had that link from the past, from the early distant past of this church to what the church is and can be. For him to have been here was a wonderful thing. And Reverend Yates Campbell of Shelby, who had recently been licensed by the church, pronounced the benediction. The past, the present, and the future. It's always happening if we keep our eyes open. We can always see something that was, something that is, and the promise of something that is to be. All we have to do is look. You don't have to be trained to do that. It's always here. It's always here. The ordinance of baptism was observed at the evening worship service and was witnessed by a full sanctuary. It was a day of celebration. There was much work yet to be done. I learned something right before the service tonight. There's so many things that it's like putting a huge puzzle together. As work was being done to empty the old building. You know how it is when you lived in a place for a while trying to move? Well, I would imagine that was the way it was when the church moved from across the street. The story that is in here of the movement of the chairs, a lot of the old chairs that many of you might have purchased for $1 each several years ago, and you might have them scattered around your home, and I have 2 or 3 that I still trip over from time to time. Those chairs were refinished. The stories I have been given were that the chairs and all the furniture was refinished as a Bible school project. Rather than the boys doing some sort of woodworking project, they did this. Well, it turns out that it might have been more like a car wash where the adults do more of the work than the kids do. I understand that there were many, many adults who spent many, many nights working on cleaning and refinishing the furniture from across the street. But much of that was brought over here. They didn't even air condition the building before the church moved in. So all of that was done as a project and was moved over as much cost cutting as possible. Many stories about the building of the building and why some things are like this and why some things are like the other. There are many, many interesting things that some of you want to relate to us as we go forward. One of the things I want to hear, and I think is important for the church to know, is what were the feelings of the people individually. How many of you, if any of you were, remember those days? How many of you walked to the old church building and looked at it and let the memories flood back? To me, I always enjoyed going to a place upon the end of its useful life as a building or a location or a facility or whatever, and just reflecting on maybe what that's meant to me. How many of you maybe walked through that old building and the memories that came to you as you thought about your life and things that had occurred in that building? Can imagine. Didn't see it. Have some photographs, but can imagine what it was like to see the old church building at night, dark, and this one over here, lighted, and a tremendous contrast between the past and the present and the future. And to know that had been so important to this end of town and to Christ's message for the world. And now it was no longer useful. It was no longer a tool that could be used by the people. The people were here, the building was over there, the bell had been rescued, many documents, papers, records apparently were burned or discarded during this time, looked upon as being of little use. A story regarding Troop 9, the Boy Scout troop here at the church. In 1940, a scout hut had been constructed on property on 2nd Avenue. It had been built by the committee, by the folks who were working with the troop, of logs that had been cut on Spencer Mountain and had been skinned with draw knives by the scouts and some of the leaders. That had stood on 2nd Avenue, but at the time that the church moved from that property over here, there was an agreement that that property would revert back to the ownership of Firestone, Texas. And so with it would go the scout hut. With no place to put the scout hut, it was dismantled. The stories are a little conflicting, but they were stored in the warehouse for a time. And some say that they were just eventually discarded. Some say that the Wesleyan hut is built from those logs. And so there's a little bit of conflict there. If anybody has the truth on that story, please let us know. But the log scout hut disappeared, and it would be several years before the scout troop would have a permanent place, which would wind up being the scout hut that we presently have. Which there's an interesting story about that building as well. We might not get to that tonight, but I'll tell you that if you're interested. A great program took place in the Southern Baptist Convention in 1954. It was called A Million More in 54. There was so much optimism, it almost appeared to be cockiness. Southern Baptists were so large and so powerful, and so many churches were being built in suburban neighborhoods. So much power was being wielded by the Southern Baptists. They said, 1 million more. We're going to grow this denomination. And things are going to continue to happen. Loray did some division of some of the facilities so that different classrooms. Use that one. Pull it. We'll continue. In spite of small technical difficulty. I'll just talk louder. Is that okay? Can you? Okay. It's 1954 witnessed the growth in membership and plans for future expansion. The nursery was modified. Large numbers of small children were in the nursery and the younger classes of the church. The first purchase of additional property for future expansion took place in 1954, and that was the purchase of the Hawkins house on Firestone Circle. And I understand that in the backyard of the Hawkins house was a very large walnut tree. And so that came into the church's possession in 1954. Just as a little footnote, there are many mentions through the records of purchases of property as the church continued to acquire property in Firestone Circle for future expansion. And I'm sure during those days there was talk of we're not in the real estate business, we're in the church business. But it continued to, if I step on anybody's toes, I'm not doing that. Or if you knew anybody that said this, I don't know. But it usually is something that said property was eventually purchased, and that's the location, of course, of our educational building today. The sketch history was published in 1954, and here's a copy of the first page of that by Loray, who was one of the first members baptized in Long Creek. How many of you been to Long Creek since we met the first time? No, okay. All right, hope you enjoyed the trip. Loray wrote the history in 1954 and says, if I have strength of mind, I will give a pretty good sketch history of the early days of the church. That's up here if you'd like to look at that. The debt on the church property was paid off in 1954, and in January of 1955, or in 54, that debt was paid. There was a note burning ceremony here at the church. January 15, 1955, the church, this building appeared on the cover of the Biblical Recorder. And we do have that copy of the Biblical Recorder in the history room. January 1955, Loray began its association with WLTC radio and did monthly, and then later weekly broadcast on that station for almost exactly 40 years. The church bought property, 2 lots, at the new Normandy Heights subdivision, which is where the old parsonage that's just recently been sold, not too long ago been sold, was located. The original parsonage, of course, stood here across from the old church and faced Franklin Avenue, which, if you can imagine and remember, Franklin before Interstate 85 and before Garrison Boulevard. All truck traffic, all transportation coming through the city of Gastonia passed in front of the church and in front of that parsonage. You can imagine trying to get a good night's sleep there. So the parsonage was to be reality because of the traffic problems there. The resignation of B.H. Moss, who had been the choir director since 1930, was accepted January 9, 1957, and Andrew Champion was hired as his replacement in September of that year. New churches continued to be established. Members from Loray continued to move away and help give their strength and their energy and vitality to those new churches. During 1956 and 1957, 44 letters of membership were granted to other churches from Loray. The parsonage was completed in 57, and the old parsonage was demolished, that had been built in 1916, was demolished sometime around 1960. Don't have the exact date on that. And now the parking lot to the west of the church is what remains of that. Broadman hymnals were replaced with the Baptist hymnal in 1958. And also in April of 1958, the first attempt at an educational building was begun. Chester, you chaired that committee, and that project was abandoned for some time. So maybe you can fill me in when we were putting this thing together. Maybe you can mention that when we have the time a little bit later. Tell us maybe what took place there. Reverend Rupert Hodges was called as associate pastor and stayed about a little over a year. The Shirley Bolden property was bought on South Millen Street in September 1959. It became eventually the Scout Hut and serves that purpose today. Real interesting story about this. And you think I've talked fast before? From now till 7 o'clock, just listen. At the back of the Scout Hut, if you'll walk back to the right side of the building, you'll see there's an extremely sharp corner there. Doesn't make any sense. That's not usable space. Why is that there? There's been a shed added onto it, but there's a very sharp corner. That's because that used to be Pete Walker's shoe shop. It stood where the Amoco station is over here now. And the P&N Railroad, the electric railroad, ran right behind that building. The building was built in a little triangle similar to what the church was building in, but much smaller. And they built right up to the edge of that property. So there's an angle about like this on the back corner of the Scout Hut, and that is a little bit of history there. Reminds us of a railroad that's long, long gone. So if you're ever interested, that's easy. You can walk over there. You don't have to go down through the briars and have people thinking funny things about you. Gasonia's population in 1960 was 37,276 people. July 31, 1960, Reverend Yates Campbell was called as associate pastor of promotion, and he moved into a house that was provided for him in the Firestone Circle behind the church. January 1961, a piece of history. Bob, we ought to have you up here and go dun-dun-dun, something like that. But, the organ was purchased. So this organ has served us well through the years and has been patched up many times, and folks keep shaking their heads and saying this thing's on its last legs, but it just keeps on playing week after week. And I know Bob just loves it and remarks about it all the time. It's what a wonderful piece of musical technology this is. Hopefully that will serve us for many, many decades to come. In 1961, October 11, 1961, Dr. Malone ended his pastorate and moved his family to Shelby, North Carolina. He had medical problems with eyesight. The church, the demands on Dr. Malone within the church were tremendous. There were many forces working within the church during that time, and because of the age and many other factors, he did leave the church and move to Shelby. Had the privilege of visiting with Mrs. Malone several years ago, and very gracious lady brought me in. I was at work, but I was in Shelby and knew that I was close to her house. Looked up the address and just knocked on the door, and I said, "I'm starting some work on the church history. Could do you have anything that you could supply me with?" And she supplied us with much information. Very gracious lady, and I have good memories of that. She helped in the early days of the beginning of collection of this information. There's some things that probably need to best be read from the church history about this time. These were times of great social changes. Social trends have been placed in motion by returning servicemen who had moved into the mainstream of church leadership. No longer were many members satisfied with unquestioning acceptance of church authority. The traditional, sometimes autocratic methods of the olden days have become subject to analysis and investigation. Many younger members have fought a war to allow people to choose their own destinies. It was apparently difficult to return home and give up some of that attitude in religious matters. That's from the church history. Dr. Malone led through some turbulent times as America readjusted to a peacetime economy and a peacetime church membership. Things have changed forever. One of the things that he probably should be best remembered for was his leadership of the church during the construction of this edifice in which we are seated tonight. This, to me, is, as I've told you earlier, is the only thing in my whole life that has not changed drastically. And I come here sometime to regain my sanity, to come back here and sit in this place that from the earliest memories of my life, I remember this room. And this place means so much to me, more than I can say tonight. And if we need to say anything to Dr. Malone, we need to say thank you, and to that building committee, and to that finance committee, that publicity committee, and that church that was able to place this building on this corner for us to enjoy today, and for those who pass us by to enjoy. Reverend Campbell had come into the church. He had come in as an associate pastor and was eventually called as the pastor. His testimony was that during the 14 months that the United States used B-29 bombers in low-level bombing over Tokyo during the latter days of the Second World War. Yates Campbell was a tail gunner in one of those things, and he prayed, "Lord, if you'll get me home, I'll serve you for the rest of my life." And indeed he did. I imagine that prayer was prayed by a lot of folks, but maybe most of them sort of forgot that when they came home. But Reverend Campbell did not, as we know from his life. He attended Gardner Webb. And he received a bachelor's degree in divinity from Southeastern Theological Seminary. Immediately following his arrival at the church, things began to happen as far as long-range planning. Very interesting period in the history of the church. You might want to read this in the history. A lot of this you will hear, a lot of it you remember. You might even want to comment on it as during the time that it's coming just shortly. I remember this book from the time I was a fairly young person on our coffee table. I think many of you had something to do with this, and I remember discussions about this thing being hashed out around the dinner table at home. This was a 10-year challenge, 1964-1974. Very interesting book. It talks about some of the strengths of this community in which we live, and it's interesting as we look forward, as we see into the 70s when this plan had run its course, that many of those strengths had gone away, had become not strengths but weaknesses. Two of those were the mention of the hospital being the city hospital being just a few blocks away, and also the fact that we had a school system. We had a high school not too far from here and a good elementary school right over here. All those things were to go away in the 70s, and we were to be faced with some changes. You might want to read that as we worked through it. The church drew up a constitution. This program took place because Loray was one of 4 strong churches chosen in the state of North Carolina to participate in the drawing up of the Constitution and also the drawing up a presentation of creation presentation of a long-range plan. So Loray was a pioneer in some of this work. As a result of this, the educational building was built. We do have the architect's presentation drawing here. It was built, and the contract was awarded to the T.R. Burroughs Construction Company for $208,530. $150,000 was borrowed by the church and was repaid over a 15-year period. When this building opened, this one was bursting at the seams, and when we moved into that building, I do remember this, when we moved into that building, we were sitting almost on top of one another in those classrooms. Now that would not be a long-term situation, as it appears that there was a wave of building across the Southern Baptist Convention during this time in the mid-60s. And it was because of the post-war baby boom children moving through the youth departments and young people's departments of the churches. And so all over this country, you will find Southern Baptist churches and churches of other denominations. You will find many of them closed, many of them not being used for the purpose for which they were built. And invariably, you will find some sort of large improvement, educational improvement that took place in the mid-60s. This happened, and we know much of that building at the present time is empty. But as this large group of young people came through, the post-war baby boomers came through the church, the educational building was not an option. It was an absolute necessity. It was built, and many of you remember, I remember the day that church was dedicated, and how excited we were when we couldn't get, there was just board over the wall there. You couldn't go through where the water fountain is into the new building, but you could every once in a while get a peek in there and see what was going on. And the day that was open, and the day that we trooped through there, how sorry we felt for all those folks in the senior high department who had to stay in the old building. I mean, we really felt, genuine sympathy for those folks because they had to stay in the old building, sitting in the opera chairs that had once been in the balcony of the old church across the way. And some of you might have those opera chairs. They were sold at the time that some of the old wooden chairs were sold. As it was interesting to hear Gene Puckett this morning talk about the changes in the 60s, the assassination. If you'll read your church history, there was a special service here at the church the day after, on Monday, November 25th, during the National Day of Mourning, after President Kennedy was assassinated on the 22nd in 1963. There was a service here, and Reverend Campbell's message was men to match those times, and the benediction was pronounced by singing the hymn America by the congregation. And then you know the turmoil of the 60s, the turmoil in the cities, the assassinations, all the things that took place. It spawned a generation of people who questioned authority to an extent that it had never been questioned before. And as it was stated this morning, our institutions will forever be changed because of that questioning attitude that has become part of our very being. We don't just accept things, and I think it's more difficult for us just to accept things by faith today. We oftentimes want to know the whys and wherefores, and much of this comes from all of this that took place, as we remember so well, in the 60s. The building of this building also launched one of the early daycare centers, daycare efforts in the city. And it was for many, many years, it was a wonderful ministry of this church, and continued that way. Blaine Pinnell was called as the Minister of Education in 1965, and when this program cranked up, Mrs. Pinnell became the director of this and served for many years until Naomi Blanton, Mrs. Buford Blanton, became director of the daycare program until it was discontinued in about 1979. Reverend Campbell in 1967 took a mission trip to Brazil, which really was somewhat of a prophecy of two things that would take place. First of all, it was almost prophetic of his moving into full-time mission work, and it was also laying somewhat the groundwork of the Brazilian trips that many of you have taken and took with Reverend White when he was pastor here. In 1967, Loray witnessed its first budget in excess of $100,000. It was $100,720.76. Ruby Hawkins, in 1967, she had been here for quite some time. For her to be as young as she is, she worked at this church as secretary for a long, long time. She started while she was just a toddler. From 1945 to 47, she worked part-time under Reverend Helen Dixon. She came as full-time secretary under Dr. Malone in 53 and worked into the Campbell pastorate in 67. During that time, Gladys Pearson came on board as financial secretary. Ruby left in 1967, and during the interim, Gladys Pearson served as financial secretary and secretary. Ruby Carpenter, who came in 1967, filled the secretary position and served faithfully for 25 years. The church published its first Pictorial directory in 1968. Don't look at it. Or if you want a good laugh, look at it. Many of you won't recognize yourselves. There was a youth recreation program that started, and it was unusual in that it was a confrontational sort of thing. A bunch of young people got together and decided the church is just not doing enough for this group. And they said, we're going to go and we're going to go to a business meeting and we're going to make them do something for us. And they went in and the church did something for them. We gave them a program and it lasted about a year and it fizzled out. But we felt real good about getting that thing passed. But that was a change that had taken place probably because of the 60s. 1970, the sanctuary was recarpeted and painted, and new choir robes were purchased, and it was like an avocado green. What were we thinking? We have seen the light. Yeah, everybody, all of you had avocado stoves and refrigerators. We were right with the time. 1970 can probably be looked at as the beginning of the decline of the community here. 1970 saw the departure of, it was following the 1968 consolidation of the Gaston County and the Gaston City Schools. Earlier, Winston Crawford, who had served several terms, I believe, on the city school board, addressed the church and warned the church prior to the consolidation vote that that the folks pushing this were pushing all the positives. They really weren't bringing the negatives to light. And he addressed the church, and don't have the contents of that address, but basically warned the folks that a lot of changes would be taking place. Shortly after the consolidation of schools, the high school that we had bragged about in 1964 as being one of the pluses for this community was changed to a junior high school, actually, the former Gastonia High School. And West School, Abernathy School, that had been opened in 1917, closed and stood there for a long time until it was finally burned. And some of you remember that day, walking over and seeing the smoke still rising from the ruins of Abernathy School. Yates Campbell resigned in November of 1972 to go to a wider mission field and became, in January of 73, the Director of Social Ministries with the Gaston Baptist Association, and served in that position for 11 years. He lived a remarkable life, and he, in spite of obstacles, lived his life to the fullest until the day he died. And many of you will recall, as I do, the day that we had a humdinger of a celebration of his homegoing that lasted well over an hour in this sanctuary, which was held April 9, 1991. During the time after the departure of Reverend Campbell, E. Lowell Spivey served himself as a colorful character, and we all, several of us still fondly recall the sermons that he talking about himself as a boy and how he always liked to collect frogs and balloons. But Lowell Spivey was a great man who stood in his pulpit until 1973. In December of 72, a Pulpit Committee was established. In early 1973, 2 more community institutions were removed from West Gastonia. The Trenton Mill closed after 80 years of continuous operation, which is, some of those of you who don't know, was behind Sears. It's a carpet outlet now. Once was a thriving mill for over 80 years and supported a thriving community village around it, which supplied members to Loray Baptist Church through many years. And also about the same time, Gaston Memorial Hospital relocated from its location on North Highland Street to its present location in the eastern part of the city. There was something that took place by the departure of these institutions and others that followed. There was a vacuum that could not be filled by the things that came in to fill those buildings. The reasons that those buildings had been built no longer was the reasons they were occupied. And many of the surrounding neighborhoods that drew their energy and vitality from those institutions began to wither following the departure of these institutions. The Reverend White, Raymond H. White, his wife Norma, and Dennis and Connie came to Gastonia July 14th, 1973. He preached a trial sermon the following day and was voted immediately following that to come to the church. Pastor's study, church office had been renovated. Quite a few things had been done here at the church, and many of you remember those days. I would like to say this about Reverend White. I would like to make this comment. Seeing him today brought back a lot of memories, a lot of feelings. As a young man, Reverend White probably influenced my feelings, my theology, my faith in those days that I was very impressionable and waiting for someone to fill me in on a lot of the answers to the questions that I had. And so he's not here, but I will pay him this compliment. Hopefully it's not a dubious compliment. He's largely responsible. I won't do that to him either. but I think he did much. He gave me many answers to questions that I had, and rather than hanging around his neck, I will say a word of thanks to him because of the answers that he supplied to me in the early days of his ministry. He was a man who came and he saw that things needed to be done and made some changes. Some were welcome, some were not. One notable not was the location of the polling place in the room that's the library now. I remember that I was neat, came in and apparently there was still enough strong feeling against separation of church and state till that thing headed for the hills after that. So we did not have a polling place, but I think one election in the church. We did, though, take over the Bloodmobile when they demolished the original Loray schoolhouse, the girls' club recreation center that stood down here where a parking lot is near Joy's house. When it was demolished, the Bloodmobile moved here. Things took place, changes in personnel. Reverend Love Dixon came on board in October of 1975. The story of his conversion is in the history. I would refer you to that. 1976 was the time of departure of the retail district from downtown Gastonia. East Ridge Mall opened, and it drew a dividing line, as it were, between East and West Gastonia. There were many things that took place during and following that time that made great differences in the sides of the city, whether it be the east or the west side. These things are the things that this our Vision 2000 task force, I'm sure, will address as we look at ourselves as a church in relationship to the side of town that has not been the most favored side of town since the 70s or possibly even the 60s. The church's dilemma was, as Loray's vision has always been, you look at a negative situation and draw what positives you can from it. It's really an amazing thing to look at this time when probably a lesser church would have looked at the future and tried to guess what the future might be, and possibly we talked about relocating. Loray instead looked to the block immediately to the east and said that there is promise there. There is ministry there. We own most of that block, and that is due to the vision of the pastor during that time and the folks who supported that work. It was interesting to note that probably when the Firestone Circle property was being purchased, on which our educational building now stands, that there were, I would imagine, folks who said, we're really not in a real estate business, we're a church. And some of you might feel this way, if you do, we can do that, we can do anything because we're Baptist. But the property in the other block over there, we own most of that, and this church is poised on the threshold of being whatever it chooses to become. And we have the option now of having some property to do with what we might need to do something with as we move only 2.5 blocks of commercial real estate property in what will probably be the next growing area of Gastonia. So these things took place, and we see in 1976, Don Benfield was called as Minister of Music and Youth. He brought some changes to that position by being the first person who was a minister of music and youth. Brought some changes. It was interesting being in the choir during those days. And then in 1977, the first singing, not that it's not interesting being in the choir analogy. Also in 1977, the first singing Christmas tree was presented at Loray. It continued through the remainder of Don Benfield's ministry and on far into the ministry of Jimmy Brown and ran for 15 years. And that's not a bad run for a production. So that was something that became part of the tradition for many years at Loray. The church went through several planning programs. We were talking about this before the before the service tonight, and I'm going to close this. You can read the rest of the book. There are a lot of other things I wanted to say, and there are things that will, if you don't catch the live performance of it, or if we don't get to it, we'll make sure that all this gets in the book. It will probably a revised version that will come out in the year 2000. And then the biggie, hopefully, if the Lord gives us all time. And as Latin Walter says, strength of mind, we'll put another one out at the 100th anniversary in 2005. Many things took place. The church went through some. We do planning real well. These plans will be different. But just to remind you, we did the big thing 64, 74. Okay, we did some more in 78. Okay, we did long-range planning committee report, did some good stuff to the facilities of the church, bold mission thrust. A lot of this stuff took place. This is where all this history stuff got started, because somebody said, I don't see anything in there about a church history. You do it. Okay, so 17 years later, here we are doing this. I never claimed to be fast. Then in 1986, we had a consultation by the Gaston Baptist Association on plans, things we could do to make ourselves a better church. And then in 1990, we did the same thing. So we do plans really well, and the challenge for the group that's getting ready to step out now is to do the plans and to give us a blueprint for following through on those. Many changes have taken place. You can read all of these things. One thing I wanted to get into was the change in the office of deacon. It has taken 2 complete circles. One circle took from 1905 until 1961, and then the other one took a shorter time. But if you'll look at the evolution, and if you ever want to talk about that, we can do that. The evolution of the deacon, the board of deacons of Loray Baptist Church, you'll see that it's taken 2 full circles. And it's interesting just to look at that and see how all those things took place. Many, many things have taken place during the life of the church. A few dates that I put together last night. September 24, 1995, Reverend White wrote a letter of resignation to the church, thanking the church and saying, I'm kind of sad leaving you guys. And we were sad to see that come to an end. That had been a friendship and a love relationship that had lasted over 22 years. Raymond White Day was on March 31, 1996. May 5, 1996, John Bowden began interim pastorate, and he emphasized during that time from the very beginning outreach and evangelism. January 11, 1997, a reception was held for John, Roxanne, Thomas, Elizabeth, and Rebecca Bridges. January 12, 1997, you might as well do this since we've done it for everyone else. Picture's good, we're just happy but it is a pretty good picture. January 12, 1997, John Bridges preaches trial sermon, and a unanimous vote follows to call him as Loray's 12th pastor immediately after the service. A couple things I jotted down. I don't know what it was. It was 11 o'clock last night, so I'm going to read this and I'm going to close with this. I do want to say thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for putting up with this, because I was up here a while ago thinking these people are sitting here like they're enjoying this. Thank you for that. Also, the history committee, and also those of you who are interested in some of this stuff. This stuff doesn't come together on its own. Somebody's got to donate it. Somebody's got to take it and catalog it. I live in Spartanburg, South Carolina now. It's a rare occasion that I get into that history room that you used to see me in every Wednesday night, sometimes on Sunday night. I don't get in there. Becky Hasty told me the place needs a woman's touch. It looks like a wreck. I'm going to continue to work with it as I can. But those of you who are interested in possibly doing a little bit of volunteer work, just a little bit of stuff to help catalog, to learn how things are brought into that, and maybe make suggestions on how we can do it better, please see me, see the pastor, call the church office, do something. If anyone's interested in this old dry stuff, we can put you to doing something. I need to thank Jimmy Brown. Jimmy has been the workhorse of this thing because he's the one who gets most of it when it comes in. And they'll say, oh, go see Jimmy Brown. They'll do something with it. And Jimmy has gotten interested in it, and he has done quite a bit of work on the history and work of this church. I want to thank him as a friend and as a co-laborer in this up to this point obscure work that we've been doing. Reverend John Bridges has sounded a bugle call to awake all of us to the possibilities which exist for our fellowship as we face the future as a unique church. We have had a glorious past, and the path ahead calls us to a new level of greatness as we determine how we will face a changing future, led by an unchanging, ever-empowering Savior, Redeemer, and Sustainer. The future is ours. Thank you.
I was going to ask you to give Tim a hand, but you just did. That was Timothy History's boy. That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. Before we, let me just say this. Before we get into the testimony time, let me just see if anyone has any questions, history questions for Tim. Do you have any questions that you might want to ask before we move on? About what? The bus.
It's in the book.
It's in the book. Good answer. I tell you what, before y'all start talking, which you may not even talk, before y'all start talking, stand up and stretch your legs for a second. Okay. Yeah, 17 strokes. Okay, we have, for lack of better, whatever to call it, call this a time of testimony. So many of you have been such a vital part of this great history that we've been talking about for the last 3 weeks. Someone said we've got so many other resources here. This is an opportunity for you to say something, a memory perhaps, or something special about this church to you. But this time I'd like to open up the floor for anyone who would like to say what you would like to say about Loray Baptist Church.
Well, John, I'd like to share some memories of me and the janitor.
Well, come on. Just stand up on that chair.
Well, the first one was his name was Uncle. We always called him Uncle, so I don't know why. That was just what we did. And Uncle Beverly was a fine, wonderful Christian janitor. And Charlie and I and my sister-in-law and brother-in-law went to his funeral. And when you go to a black brother's funeral, you see a lot. But he was another one came that was called Uncle George, and he was a character. I would be in the church office, and I would be hearing somebody saying, and wasn't nobody here but me and him. I'd heard this sounds coming in, and I'd say, I wonder who that is. I got to find that. I said, I might have been in this church with all that sound coming in. And so I heard somebody say, I went upstairs, and Uncle George was mopping. But he was mopping to a old spiritual. that he had in his mind. He'd swish that mop up through that squeeze through and slap it down. He said, yeah, Jesus rode through Jerusalem triumphantly. And he'd slap it down again and he'd say, Jesus rode through Jerusalem triumphantly. And he would just really, and then one day I heard him saying something. I got out here and he was preaching from this pulpit. He had him a captive audience, and he was giving them down the country. And he was real special. But one day, he had to help me get the messages up on the bulletin board. And I took out this old one out here and had to lock the door, And I said, now, Uncle George, you're going to have to go out there with me and unlock it and let me give you the letters to put up. And I had them all and one day he lost the keys. He said, oh, said Dr. Malone's going to be upset. And he was worried. I thought he was going to have a stroke. But he called his son and he come out and he said, now Daddy, said, I can take the locksmith and get you another key made. Said, just don't worry about Dr. Malone being upset, that we'll find you one. But he was precious. I really enjoyed him so much and all of and so me and the janitors, I had a really good time with all of them.
Some of the forgotten folks that make it happen. Uncle George. I heard about Uncle Clint, but I hadn't heard about him.
Yeah.
You got a story about Uncle Clint? I said no. Okay.
Well, as Tim mentioned, I'll just take a brief moment about forming another building committee. When we moved in this church, we did not have room to put people in the Sunday. We didn't have enough room to put the Sunday school. So, in 1955, was one of the years I was superintendent of Sunday school, and we would try to go over to the church, figure out where to change the flags, where to get more people. And we ended up in forming a building committee, and I was made chairman of it. But it hadn't been very long, since we got in this building. And I think the reason we didn't go forward, the interest just, as far as coming forth with the money, they knew we needed the space, but coming forward with the money and going through with another that quick, I think, so the deacon decided to put it off for a while. But we were just bursting the slings.
Where did everybody sit? Just on kind of top of each other?
Well, we did things like they had a choir room where the office is now, and they had to take it for Sunday school class. Yeah, the balcony, and they took the choir then, a little later, they had what they call a parlor, what is the choir room now, and so the choir started meeting in there. There was just a number of changes. We were looking all the time for something that would give us more.
Yeah, thank you. Right there. Okay.
Our Sunday school attendance had an average at that time in 55, in fact, there were 550 something
Yeah.
average.
It was as much as, I looked back several months ago, it was up even in the 400s and the 60s after the building, the new building. One of the interesting phenomena about buildings is that churches build at their peak and very seldom go more than what they build for, which is an interesting phenomenon.
Well, I know Kim's gonna say, oh no, mother stood up, wants to say something. But I've been in this church too long not to say something now. I have so many pleasant memories. I have memories of being a teenager in the old church. I was married over there. And actually, Tim was born while we were still in the old church. He was 6 months old when he came into this church. In fact, that was the first day that he had been brought to church, because they just didn't have facilities over there that for a newborn. And so I just had not brought him. And he came the first day that this church opened. I brought him. He was born in September, and this was on Easter Sunday, March. Easter Sunday. He was about 6 months old. But like I say, we were married there. John and I were married there. In fact, we were married by Reverend Ellis Dixon, and I think that must have been the last thing he did as pastor of Loray. But the one thing that stands out in my mind about the old church more than anything else is Dr. Ridley being in the pulpit. He would not put up with children misbehaving. And poor little Summer, she got a whole lot of how I was when I was young. And I was talking to a friend, and Dr. Ridley stopped. He was a tall, thin man, and he stopped and he pointed that long pointed finger right at me and called me by name and told me that I better be quiet. And there are just so many things I could stand up here. I could almost write a history of things I remember. Thank you.
John, I remember one time I got in real bad trouble because of this building.
That's before you were chairman of the deacons.
That was more times are coming. But
Stand up, Barry.
I remember when this was just a big deep hole they had graded out for the basement and all. And of course the church had forbid anybody coming over here because it was dangerous, you know. Well, me and my brother didn't think that meant us. So we had to come over here and examine what was going on. I remember they had a scaffold built out here for some reason. And it had just rained. And of course there was red mud all under here. And for some stroke of fate, I fell off the scaffold into the mud. And of course there was no denying what I had done then. But I remember I got a severe scolding from preacher Dr. Malone and from my mother and dad too. So I learned right then that I needed to pay attention and obey. But I remember this church calling me, posting me a lot of grief.
I still grieve. Little did he know the future chairman of the deacons, he was scolded.
Because of this opinion.
Deep hole. Deep hole there.
John?
Yes, sir.
My name's I've been in this church too long, I want to say something. This church has really meant so much to me for 4 years. And it really was instrumental in bringing me back to the Lord. I would say when I was young and baptized, and I went into service, and I fell away from the Lord, and started living in sin, and then came out after the war, began my old ways, got married, started raising a family, but was still living in sin. But in 1952, after this church was dedicated, some of the men started visiting me. And although it wasn't easy, I rejected them time and time, and I didn't hide, and I'd see them coming and things like that. But they continued visiting me and didn't give up. So I walked down the aisle of this church in 1953, and my family joined this church. And I'm just proud to say that I raised my children, my family in this church. I was able to see each one of them come to know Jesus and be baptized in this church. And that means so much to me. And on through life, there's just so many, many times this church, the people has meant so much to me. With the prayers, the special time, the need that I have asked for prayer of these people. A time when my son had brain surgery, and another time when I had some problems. But I'd rather have the prayers of these people than anything I know of any time I need. These people are saints and I compete. And I just love this church. I've always loved it. And I'm just proud to be a part of this task force that's going to try to see what God has for us in the future. And I know He does have something. We've had some trying times in those 44 years. We've had some wonderful good times, and I just believe that the Lord's not through with us yet.
Thank you. Somebody else.
I have some fond memories of the old church. My husband and I, my first husband, Shirley, and I were both baptized over there on the same night. We had been Christians before, but we looked at another denomination, so we were both baptized over there. And our daughter, Carol Pugh, who lives in Boone now, is also baptized over there. So we've grown up in Loray Baptist Church too, and I love all our church family. It means so much to me to be here.
Brother Pastor, I've been around here quite a while too. My wife and I, we got out of service in 1945, I believe it was. And we moved to Gastonia, and we was living at Overhill over here. He knows where Overhill Terrace used to, I don't know whether you do or not. Your daddy does, your mother does. But we was living in the government apartment. I never will forget the third Sunday I come to church in the old church across the street over there. John Long was in charge of it over there. And I'm like Barry, I didn't fall in the ditch, but I was sitting on the back, kind of on the back seat, and John asked me to lead in prayer. And I had never made a confession or rededicated my life or anything. But I got up and I said a few words, and I sat back down. I don't even remember what I said. I tried to forget about it. But there's several people that Tim mentioned tonight that I knew. I knew Brother Walter. And the first Sunday school class I was in at the old church was Yates Campbell class. Yates Campbell was my Sunday school teacher. And then he took a notion he wanted to go up to Garden Web and go into the ministry. And from there, I was in Alan Harmon's class. He mentioned him a while ago. And Alan was a layman that could speak Greek, believe it or not. He could speak a couple languages besides that. And they finally transferred him from the Firestone Mill to Columbus, Georgia. That's where they transferred him to, because Alan come back. Alan's mother used to live here, and his father. And he'd come back a couple of times to see me. But I have been delighted in visitation in this church. I have seen quite a few people give their hearts to the Lord. I have been down on my knees with a lot of people. Ray England and Cahill Fraley and I used to visit around here in one of the furniture trucks. We didn't have no car. We had to walk or either go in the truck. In that old, I forgot what kind of car Ray had. We called it Noah's Ark, is what we called it. We traveled in that car and we went to see people, and Ray told me one time, he said, Sarge, if we had a new Cadillac to drive, some of these people could say, boy, we really had it. When we moved into this church, it was in Ray England's class, and we had 8 people in the class when we moved over here. In a year's time, we had 36 in that class right out here where the literature room is now. We really did. And I have seen this church grow. I have been a witness all over this place. We used to get out and brush the bushes, as you call it, and bring them in here and get them baptized. I have been assistant superintendent of Sunday school for several years when Brother Smith used to be, and when Talmadge McCoy was. And Ray was the superintendent of Sunday school for a while. Then I started with Jean Brock. She had 5th and 6th grade boys, and I started teaching up there. And then I went from there to the young people. I've seen quite a few young people give their hearts to the Lord. And I also served for 20 years in the RAs. I had as many as 30 boys in our race one time. This old boy here helped me. He'll tell you the truth about it. We've seen many one of them give their hearts to the Lord. Right there sits the last one.
Thank you, Sarge. Is there anything you didn't do?
There wasn't nothing I did.
Thank you for that. Anybody else? Okay.
The Hawkins house set where the educational part is now. And we saw the church being built, and the plans. But while we were living in the Hawkins house, the outside, when you go down to the basement, it just had rails around it. And so one day a little boy came, Alvin told me, said, "Ruby, we lived through the tracks and this church being built," and I said, one of these days, one of these little boys is going to fall in that thing. And so it came to pass. I was in the house and heard this little boy scream, and he had fallen. He had come to his stool and was walked inside the rails, and he fell 3 stories. And I went flying down there, and it looked like you had taken a chop axe and had hit him right in the head with it. And I told my younger brother-in-law, I said, "Run up there and get me a quilt. I'm going to keep him warm and call 911. And so Dr. Malone was notified, and Dr. Malone prayed all night for that child. And he recovered. But that was something I saw that was prophesied by Alvin. Said, we lived through the tracks and we lived through these. So if Alvin was here, he could testify that we had some kind of going on with the tracks and keeping the kids off of the tracks and keeping them from falling down into the pit. But this was an experience I didn't like, but I was glad I could do it in time to do something about it. And so those were some of the things that we like to forget, but it was part of the things that I remember happening. And so that was another thing.
And so you said you had 2.
Oh,
Go ahead and sit down. You'll remember. Anybody else? Tim mentioned earlier that we're good at planning. And one of the things that I'll just say that by design, did not do was call this a long-range planning committee. Because I know the church has done that a lot. And I think that's good and fine. But I think we're facing a transitional period of history unlike any other period that we face. And I really hope that this can be not your typical long-range planning committee. That a lot of times that happens and good things come from it, but a lot of times it's just a nice book that you look at and don't follow through with it. So we have by design not called it a committee or put long range in it because I'm not sure how far we can see. But I do feel like because of Dr. Puckett spoke this morning of his being able to feel the spirit, the positive spirit among you as God's people, the energy there. And I think we have a unique opportunity to seek God's dream for us. Certainly history, even though we say it does, it repeats itself, history never repeats itself. So we cannot and would never attempt to recreate the past. But we are a unique people. We have always been innovative, progressive, creative, because of that, I believe we can again. And God's going to use us. God's not through with us yet, George, like you said, and I appreciate that. So I am excited, and I hope you will be excited with me as we move forward to the year 2000. I think I told you about the gentleman in Grove that said he had to renegotiate with God. I told him about 30 years ago, just let me live to the year 2000. Well, he's about 65 now. Said he had to renegotiate because year 2000 is so close. Like Craig said this morning, 2000, what we're going to be in 2007, which sounds like a long time. 2007. But how many remember 1987? I mean, that was not long ago, was it? 1987? Well, you do that again, and it's going to be 2007. Tim and I are getting to be old.
I won't be.
You don't know that, son. I don't say that. You don't know that. 10 years, how old are you?
I'll be 100 years old.
You would not. How old are you now?
I'm 78.
Well, you just be 88.
That's just 10 years.
That's what I said. We got people that's over 90 now hanging around doing good. I'm not kidding. You never know. You might live longer than I do. Any others? Anybody else? Go ahead. Come on. Preacher's wife's going to talk.
I have two things that I want to say. First of all, is that I don't usually talk. But I learned, it took a while, but John served 3 churches as pastor prior to being here. And I never actually got up and said thank you until we left. And every time I'd say, I need to do that before we leave. So tonight I want to say thank you. It's not been even a year yet, and in so many ways it seems like I've known you just forever. You've become such a part of my life and that of John's and our children. And so I thank you for that. It's just been a really, really good, however long, 7, 8 months. We're coming up on an anniversary in November of when we met with the committee the first time, which just sort of, it's like John says, 10 years ago just seems like yesterday. Well, that just seems like yesterday, but in reality, Rebecca was only 6 weeks old, and she's already passed that 1 year birth date, and is walking around, and before long she'll be talking. So time does fly. But I want to say thank you to Robert Blaylock. In early 1996, a friend of John said, Loray Baptist is going to be coming open. And I was like, well, so what? We weren't interested in going anywhere. Things were really good where we were, and we felt we're being used of God. Things were just good. And we had kids in school, and I'd gone back to work, and things were just going right along according to our plan. In February of that 96 is when I found out that things were no longer according to my plan. But Rebecca was on the way. And with that, I did sort of like John was talking about the guy in Grover renegotiating. I renegotiated with God in a way that I never had and said, okay, God, this is certainly not anything I had in mind, but I believe that it is of you, and because of that, it's okay, and I believe it will be good. Well, it has been wonderful, and that taught me a whole lot. As the pregnancy progressed, I began to open up myself in many other ways to him and to his leadership, so that when Robert Blaylock called in November of 96, the same year that I said, so what about Loray being open, and talked with John on the phone, and John said, I think we need to meet with these people. I said, Lord, I don't think this is what I want, but I don't know really what's best. So I'm leaving that up to you. And we met with that committee, and the rest is history. It was a very positive meeting, and everything following that has been positive. And for that, I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I can't say it enough. For the love you showered upon us, for the way you have taken in Thomas, Elizabeth, and Rebecca as your own. You can't know what that means to me as a mother, just to see all that. I just believe that you can't love children enough. And I feel like my children are so fortunate because they get that. And I thank you for it. The other thing I want to say is that which impressed me truly about the search committee, the pastor search committee that we met with last November, was that of the many things they said, the one thing that I kept hearing or kept feeling from them was the love they had for this place. Not just this place, not just this area of West Gastonia, not just this building, even though they were very proud of that, and rightfully so, but the love they have for this community of faith. And I began to think, well, God, I might want this after all. This can be a very, very good thing because I think I want to be a part of that. And I have realized that. I see that in you all the time. And I'm very proud now to say that this is my church. I haven't earned the right to speak of it historically as you have because my memories here are very short. But I'm very proud to call it my church and hope that in years to come I will have memories to share, as many of you have tonight. Thank you again.
Anybody else? Okay, I'm going to close. Roxanne touched briefly toward the end on one of the things that I wanted to say. One of the things I may or may not have said to you about me is the importance of place, the sacredness of place. For some reason or other, the way I'm made as a human being, where I am is important. And being where I think I am supposed to be in terms of place, geographic, sacred place, is significant. And quite honestly, I was born in Cleveland County. I was raised in Cleveland County. I was educated in Cleveland County. I graduated from college in Cleveland County. I was married in Cleveland County. I was saved, baptized, ordained, married. My mom was buried in Cleveland. Everything that's ever happened to me, worth 2 cents, was in Cleveland County. So quite honestly, it's hard for me to think about leaving that place. But when I walked in the room to have lunch with the search committee, within moments, I knew that I was in the place I was supposed to be. It had nothing to do with the ground, it had to do with the spirit and the people. And as the relationship developed and has grown to this point, and in a mystical, weird, I can't put it into words sort of way, I feel like I've always been a part. This I can't explain it. Maybe it's my heritage, my family background. But I can say to you honestly that I have never in my life felt like I was more exactly where I was supposed to be in this place than I am tonight with you.
I'd like to say, I think we've come back, you've come back to this lesson at the Loray Baptist Church in Harmon.
Yes, sir. So for somebody who's got that much blood ground in Cleveland County to feel as right about being where I am as I feel, it must be God. That's the only way I can explain it. And I'm grateful for the commitment you have to this place. And it's hard to pin down, like I said, talk about it. It ain't the building. It's not West Gastonia. But in a sense, it is. It's this place. Tim said this place regained his sanity. When we walked in, when Charles Hammond brought, I think it was Charles, who brought us in here? And Barry brought us in this room the first time. I could feel God. I'm hard not to get emotional. But God is not through with us yet. There are people in this neighborhood, in this community, and in this city that need what we have to offer. We're not anything but who we are. But we have the Spirit of God at work. And we're not going to reach everybody. I'm no fool. And I've been to West Gastonia. I came before I came. But there are people out there that are broken and hurting and in need of the care and the love that you have in you that was given to you by God. And we're going to find a way to communicate that and continue this proud heritage that we've been. And I thank you. I want to thank George and Doris and all those that kicked my behind about getting this picture right here, because I didn't want to do it, I'll be honest with you. I just think, I want my picture made. They do that when the guys did and gone. I didn't know they did them all at one time. I learned some stuff in this. But I want to thank you for that because of how proud it makes me to have my picture on that wall. And I thank you. Anything else? Thank you, Tim, so much. Thank everybody for your participation, for your presence, for everything. Let's bow together in prayer. Father, you are God. You were here in 1905. You're here tonight. You'll be here in 2005, in 2015, 2025. We thank you, O God, for allowing us to be a part of your great work in this place. We are incomplete, O God, without you. But as you live in us, you enable us to serve you, to serve those around us to the best of our ability. Enable us, O God, to catch the vision, your vision, of who you want us to be as we seek to bear witness to the saving love of Jesus Christ in this place, today and forever. Dismiss us now in the name of Christ. And thank you all.